Good morning and welcome to another edition of Give Me an Answer. We are thrilled this morning to have on Professor Dr. Raymond Tallis. He used to teach at the University of Manchester. He has published over 30 books and much more articles, many articles as well. So big on neuroscience, big on secular humanism. He's going to talk about atheism, perhaps versus secular humanism, some similarities, differences. Two great books he has out with fascinating titles. One is Seeing Ourselves, Reclaiming Humanity from God and Science. And then the newest is going to be Freedom and Impossible Reality. So much to break down there as well. Raymond, thanks so much for coming on.
It's a real pleasure. It's an afternoon for me. And so thank you for getting up so early.
Well, okay, so starting off here, I like that you just mentioned before we went on about the difference between atheism and secular humanism. Do the majority of your colleagues, friends, do they know you as an atheist or do they know you as a secular humanist? And if a secular humanist, are they able to understand kind of the difference?
I think so. It's more a question of being defined by what one doesn't believe. And as a secular humanist, I believe many, many things. And I have a conception of humanity and some ideas about how the world works and so on. So in a sense, it's more, it's a desire not to be defined by that which one doesn't believe. So I'm not just a merely not theist, as it were. I feel I'm hopefully more positive than that.
That's helpful. So an atheist could be like this glass of water. That could be an atheist.
Well, I guess so, except it wouldn't positively formulate the idea that there is no God unless you have very, very special quality glass of water across the Atlantic. The ones in the UK don't really have any metaphysical preconceptions.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, so what are some of those positive beliefs out of secular humanism? And is secular humanism growing, you would say, in the UK and here in the States?
It's difficult to know. In a sense, you're asking a factual epidemiological question to which I couldn't give an honest, well-informed answer. I think there is the general impression that certainly in Europe, secularism is becoming more and more predominant. Of course, worldwide, religions are making quite a significant comeback. Part of the reason being that those who have religious beliefs tend to have more children than those who don't have religious beliefs. So there is, as it were, a population explosion within people who believe things, which isn't evident in people who have a secular outlook. As for my positive beliefs, first of all, yes, I do not think that we can be explained in supernatural terms, that we were handmade separately by God, and that the world, as it were, had a creator. I don't embrace that particular viewpoint. But on the other hand, I reject with perhaps much greater fervor the view that because we are not supernatural, we are therefore merely pieces of nature. That is to say, that we are mere organisms, and in fact, we're just rather smart chimps. And it's been a long-standing preoccupation of mine to emphasize the difference between human beings and the rest of nature, and in particular, the rest of the animal kingdom.
What is that difference?
Would you like a 2-hour answer or 4-hour answer? It's very complex.
Just the high points.
I mean, there are many ways in which we are different. It begins particularly in the way that our consciousness is probably different even from our nearest primate kin. There are aspects of our consciousness that we have and that they don't have. At the heart of it is something that the philosophers call intentionality. That is to say, the property of consciousness of being about something other than itself. And in human beings, there is joined intentionality. We share things to a degree that is not seen in other animals. And one marker of that is pointing. And either of you, well, you will have had a child, Cliffe, of course, we can see the fruit in front of us. But children as young as 10 or 11 months point things out. They share their consciousness. They have joined intentionality. Children are always pointing at things. And that is a marker of the way that we are not merely individuals, but parts of a community of mind in the way that's not seen in other primates. And the consequences of that, which sound rather abstract, are vast. And perhaps we can talk through some of those.
Stepping back to kind of your first point there, in terms of the origin of the universe, and what do you make of Albert Einstein saying the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible? Do you relate with that statement or disagree? What do you think?
The reason I'm smiling is I wrote a book called Logos, which is absolutely about that particular statement of Einstein's. And actually what he said was it's the greatest mystery is that it's comprehensible, or strictly partially comprehensible. And I agree, there is something extraordinarily strange about a minute part of the universe, human beings like you and me, being able to put the universe in inverted commas and to talk about it. My little pinprick head can, at least in theory, embrace the universe. So that is something profoundly mysterious. And it's something that I share the sense of wonder at that very much.
So that's why we love that Einstein himself stated that he knew less than 1% there is to know in the universe. But what about Wigner, who won the Nobel Prize in 1961, and he talked about the complete, utter unreasonableness of mathematics? What do you make of that?
I think he's absolutely right. And actually that very famous paper points out other things as well. It does seem astonishing. And one example he gives is Newton's law of gravity, which Newton confirmed, as it were, to plus or minus 4%. And so he produced this law, which is supposed to apply to the whole of the universe, to plus or minus 4% accuracy on the basis of his observations. Subsequent research has refined the law to the point where it looks as if it's sort of 0.00001% accurate. So this is the kind of staggering observation that made Wigner astonished, as I am, at the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. But there's something very important in that paper. He says, of course, mathematics will tell you how things go if several things are put in place. First of all, initial conditions, initial position, and the existence of things. You have to have those put in by hand, if you like. And once you've got those put in, then you can see how the universe would unfold according to physical mathematical laws. But that is, I think, the important reservation that Wigner had.
So perhaps Kepler coming around saying something similar when it comes to if there's a law, there's probably a lawgiver. And you talking about those kind of obviously something almost seemed like the game has been fixed in terms of how things are set up, waiting for us to get here. How do you explain taking that step back and saying, okay, when Wigner talks about the unreasonableness of this, it truly is unreasonable to think perhaps that there is not a mind behind it all?
I don't think he was going to draw that conclusion, but
right.
It's interesting you say where there are laws, there are lawgivers. I think that's rather an anthropomorphic interpretation of the laws of physics. In my most recent book, I look very closely at the very nature of a law of physics. And in a sense, those laws are not regulative. They don't either push the universe forward or steer it like a horseman steering a horse. They are simply the habits of the universe, the most general habits, or as other philosophers describe them, just the most real patterns. So in a sense, to move from laws to lawgivers, I wouldn't make that move very quickly, because we need to look a little bit more closely what we mean by a law of nature, and to, as it were, remove the anthropomorphic sense of somebody laying down the law and saying, thus shall the universe unfold.
Richard Dawkins, Dr. Tallis, said, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Why do you think it's fair to say it's just an appearance? What about the idea that, no, this appearance of being designed points us to the fact that indeed it really was designed?
Yeah.
I think there's quite a difference between standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon and saying, all right, this Grand Canyon was carved out through erosion by some pretty natural processes, versus going to the foot of Mount Rushmore, looking up at the heads of Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and saying, that just happened by natural processes. If I'm walking along the beach and I see ripples in the sand, I understand the ocean did that, the tide did that. But if, as I continue down the beach, I see in the sand the words, John loves Mary, that clearly points me to some type of intelligent mind. So how do you think through that issue?
Well, I'm with Richard Dawkins to a certain extent, and perhaps we can come to the where I don't agree with him in due course. But it seems to me the Darwinian story does give you an account of how it is that which survives and multiplies has in some way to be adapted to its environment. That's the condition of its surviving and multiplying. So clearly there will be a process by which more complex organisms emerge, organisms that are more attuned to their environment, that are more attuned to a broader and broader environment, increasing its options. So you will get the sense of purpose being built into these organisms, but you can see how mechanism, and particularly the Darwinian mechanisms, could generate the sense of purposive organisms.
But if that's true, that survival of the fittest or the evolutionary upward movement is really at the heart of reality, then why is there this innate drive within human beings to understand more than just preserve the species? Why is there this innate drive within human beings to understand purpose and meaning? And then if I begin to realize that my birth is an accident and my death is an accident, then in reality, the only thing that lies between those two accidents is another accident, my life. Doesn't that lead to some schizophrenia, to some real division in one's thinking, in one's personhood?
Yeah, what a good question. I mean, it seems to me that I embrace Darwinism, but what I reject is Darwinitis, what I call an inflamed state of Darwinism, where we believe that Darwinism can explain not only the emergence of the organism Homo sapiens, but people, persons, the first person subject, and so on. And that's where I think Darwinism cannot produce the answers. And there is absolutely no doubt that there is a profound difference between ourselves and even our nearest primate kin. I don't believe that, perhaps I'm wrong here, that, say, chimpanzees are preoccupied by their metaphysical status or make profound generalized inquiries into the nature of the world, or even have such a sense of death that they are preoccupied with the presence or absence of meaning in the world. So if we are good Darwinians, as I want to be, but reject Darwinitis, I've got to produce a story of how we came to be so different, to give a biological account of how we ultimately became so distant from biology as we three are. That account is quite a complex one, and it occupied 3 volumes of a trilogy, some 1,000 pages, which I published in 2003, 2004, 2005. But if your listeners can stand it, or your viewers can stand it, then I'll be very happy to do a little bit of 1-paragraph précis of it, of how we became to be so different, to indeed seek purpose when there's nothing purposive within the processes that led to the human organism.
Well, why do we have this drive for purpose, according to your worldview?
I think we have a sense of ourselves, which, and hence a sense of our mortality, a sense of our position in the world, sense of the kinds of things we are, and a sense of others. And all of those things give us a desire, as it were, to have a life that makes unfolding sense, a life within ourselves, and more importantly, a life with others. And that's why we produce such incredible, magnificent cognitive monuments, such as religion. It is the desire to, if you like, encounter ourselves through the lens of something bigger than ourselves.
All right, so when the Russian cosmonauts went out in space, they said to Nikita Khrushchev years ago, when they returned, "We didn't see God out there." When the American astronauts came around the moon and saw the Earth rising, first view of the Earth rising for any human being, they read Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
I think the basic mistake that the Russian cosmonauts made was to fail to recognize that there is a transcendent being who created the universe. And the idea of being able to find God inside the universe and to try and physically locate God, be it in outer space or be it on the planet, is totally unreasonable. It shows a major breakdown in one's thinking. Whereas the American astronauts had a worldview that acknowledged that there is a transcendent being who began the universe, who began space and time. And that is why they stood in awe of this transcendent being and did not make the fatal mistake of insisting that because I haven't seen God on Earth and because I haven't seen God here in outer space, therefore God does not exist. Does that make any sense?
It most certainly does. And I guess I've got enough sort of Wikipedia level theology to recognize that looking for God as a thing is a mistake, but looking for God separate from the creation or the universe is a mistake. It's a theological mistake. And so I wouldn't expect, if I was a believer, to find God. But if I was going to find anywhere, I'd probably as most likely find it in a flower on a spring day, as I would looking at the universe from a spaceship. But I think we secular humanists have got to be honest, because even though we may reject the creation story, the alternatives aren't very impressive. I mean, if you think of the story that physicists give us, it sounds more like creative accounting than creation story. I'm thinking of the story that the universe grew out of instability in the quantum vacuum, and it suddenly bobbled from nothing into something. And I say, well, hang on a moment, I'm no more going to believe that story of the creation than I'm going to believe the story from the Old Testament. So I mean, I have to be honest and to say, as a secular humanist, I have no better account of how the world originated and why it is ordered than people who have religious beliefs.
Yeah. But is it not more reasonable to think that behind order and design there is a designer? Is it not more reasonable to believe that behind this innate drive for meaning and purpose in life, there is someone who created us for a purpose? Is it not more reasonable to believe that behind this human experience of love, that there is not just an impersonal it, but that there's a personal God of some type who created us with this innate ability to love? And is not the innate human experience for life, for desiring life after death and for hope, pointing us to the fact that indeed our mortality is not exactly the whole story, that indeed there might be life after death, because it's amazing how we as human beings all innately share this desire for life after death? I mean, does not all of that experience of reality make it more reasonable to believe in the beginning God than it is to believe in the beginning hydrogen?
I wonder if it is. It seems to me that if you describe the universe as designed, you've already, in a sense, loaded the conversation by implying that there is a designer. And it seems to me that certainly the universe seems to have habits, and there are beautiful structures and so on and so forth, all of which could have some explanation through the impersonal laws of physics. But having said that, it seems to me that we secular humanists have to acknowledge that there is much in ourselves that transcends nature. Cliffe and Stewart as persons are not just two bodies or two organisms. That's absolutely sure. So there is something quite different between yourself and other animals, and indeed between yourself and the material world. There's very little of your consciousness that can be captured by appealing to the laws of physics. But having said that, I suppose all I can say is my sense of possibility, which still remains open, it doesn't seem to, as it were, gather itself up into an explanation in terms of a God who both created myself and the universe and implanted a purpose in my life. All I can say, it's probably maybe more of a fact about me than about the universe, but it's just the case that, as it were, my sense of possibility doesn't add up to a God-shaped whole in understanding.
Based off of that, Immanuel Kant, when he talked about that he's amazed with the moral law within himself and humanity, and then also by the starry skies above.
Yeah.
Maybe some of these are some of the intangibles that you're kind of alluding to, and that physics can't really touch. And then also Francis Collins, who is Dr. Fauci's boss at the current moment, at least, and also head of the human genome. He came to know Christ. Brilliant mind, obviously. The medical mind, doctor mind. Frequently, I'll hear atheists say, "Oh, there's no real doctor who truly believes that there is a personal God." But Fauci, and we know so many who obviously just totally break that stereotype. But Fauci gave an interesting one in terms of, sorry, not Fauci, but Collins gave an interesting one in terms of why he came to ultimately believe in a personal God. And he started with more of a theistic, but he said he would have agreed with probably Kant in understanding there's some moral law within, and there's some intense love for humanity that Darwin couldn't touch. And we know Darwin didn't lose his faith because of his own new philosophy that he brandished, but it was because of evil and suffering, and he couldn't believe in a good God who allowed such evil and suffering. But Collins goes on to say that one of the things that led him to Christ was, if you see your enemy drowning in a river, for some reason, the vast majority of humans will somehow try and find a way to save him. Many humans will even go to the point of jumping in, risking their own lives to save him or her. How can that make sense? Why do you think Collins struggled with that one so much as an atheist, and that was one of the things that led him to become a believer?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I agree with you. A lot of scientists I know, a lot of doctors know, believe in either theistic God or indeed a personal God. So you're absolutely right. It isn't, as it were, part of the job description of being a doctor or a scientist that you don't embrace a certain metaphysical viewpoint. But it seems to me that the impulse that has been described, I mean, there can be a Darwinian sense, a Darwinian explanation, not that I accept it. It is the desire, as it were, to save members of our own species. It has biological advantage, that it will, as it were, promote the replication of our genome. I don't accept that. It just seems to me that what is it to be a self? Well, being a self is inseparable from being with others. The notion that I is rooted in we is one that I would embrace as a secular humanist. So when I see somebody drowning, it's me drowning, it's my wife drowning, even though that person is a stranger. So I think one can.
What about an enemy, though?
I beg your pardon, sorry.
Sorry, Raymond. What about an enemy, though?
Even an enemy, because there is that moment when you realize that she or he is a person like me. And I think at that moment, I mean, we've all had moments when people who really, really infuriate you, and then you're suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of sympathy for them, for the things that make them infuriating. And this, what you're describing, is something on a bigger scale. So, of course, it isn't a question of that can't be explained in, as it were, nature read in tooth and claw, Darwinism, but it can be explained in the sense of what it is to be a person, and that I am what I am through others, and those others normally have a certain boundary. My wife, my family, my colleagues, people who vote the same as me, etc., etc. But there's no sharp boundary there. And when you see someone in an extreme situation, you realize this could be me. And
do you think the heart of humanity then has kind of evolved to become more perhaps moral and good over the years, just like we've evolved in other ways, especially in our thinking and ability to do science and technology? Do you think our humanity has increased and headed in the same direction?
2 points to be careful here. The word evolved has an awful lot of Darwinian weight to it, and I think one's got to be careful. Changed, we might say. Evolved implies Darwinian processes, and I don't believe that cultural evolution, so-called, is really evolution in the Darwinian sense. As for whether we're becoming, as it were, better, that the better angels of our nature are dominating over the beasts within, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you'll be familiar with Steven Pinker's work, looking at the extent to which we seem to behave better than we did in the past. And I wrote a great fat book, 500 pages long, called Enemies of Hope, which looked at, was against pessimism about humanity, about behave to others. It does seem to me that things that were regarded as perfectly normal in the past are now regarded with appropriate horror, whether it's murdering all of your enemies when you win a battle, or basically enslaving others. All of those things are now regarded with horror. So I do believe there has been progress. What has driven that progress? People who have religious beliefs would say it's belief in God. Those of us who don't have religious beliefs would actually see it as a consequence partly of the Enlightenment, although that had dark side as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how in the Enlightenment, historically speaking, I think was largely influenced by Christians. And I think the Dark Ages weren't as dark as people truly think that they were. And I think you look at monasticism and how so many of the Christian monks pushed not just their own religious writings, but so much more than just that, that there was this type of revolution, and not evolution, but I like how you kind of parsed words there. I think the revolution that came from that, and especially with where we are at today, at least here in the US, the Judeo-Christian values that have really sparked the growth here of the human conscience, but also why do human rights? I think science can't answer that question. And Steven Pinker himself said, I'm not even going to go there. I'm not going to touch it because I have no idea where our hunger for human rights comes from, especially to help those who are on the other side of the world. There's no strong argument for it from a secularist standpoint. And so I like that Pinker was honest enough with that. But it's just interesting how I've heard some folks say also when it comes to humanism versus Judeo-Christian roots, and how humanism is kind of just, it's getting rid of the roots, but it's keeping the top of the hedges kind of alive. And the question is that type of heart, as well as the goodness perhaps that we've drawn from those Christian roots, is that going to be able to survive from the secular humanist point of view, or is it just going to crumble and die?
You've obviously been reading my latest book, because I spend many pages looking at that. And one can, as it were, answer that question in two ways. One is to say, well, would you expect in principle that if religious belief and the constraints that come from religious belief and the idea of being judged by God, if that was withdrawn, would we all basically become brutes, seeking our own interest without any concern for others? So you could say, would that in principle would happen? And it seems to me that if those of us who believe that religion is a human construct, a fantastic, most wonderful human construct, you can see that if we're beautiful enough to create religion, we're probably beautiful enough to behave reasonably well to each other when religion goes. That's one thing. But then there's you can have an empirical approach. This is the medic coming out in me now, and say, well, how do people behave in secular societies? Are the most secular societies the most brutal? And of course, the answer to that is clearly not. We think of Scandinavia, which has a very high level of secularity, where people treat each other with extraordinary levels of decency and courtesy, and where civic discourse is at a very high level, and where basically politics is remarkably impressive. So it looks like there's no principled reason why we shouldn't carry on being decent to each other without, as it were, the threat of divine judgment. And there doesn't seem to be any empirical evidence that we start behaving badly when, as it were, we no longer believe in God, or the majority of the population doesn't see the belief in God as central to their behavior.
All right, Raymond, if I have a Ford motor car sitting in front of you and me, and if I ask you or tell you, I'll give you two choices, but you have to pick only one, either Henry Ford.
Can I take legal advice before I answer this question?
Either Henry Ford or the natural laws governing internal combustion are the reason for this car being here. I think that you would rather quickly respond, Cliffe, you've set up a false dichotomy. You've said it's either Henry Ford or laws of internal combustion. Cliffe, I think you're setting up a contradiction between origin and operation. I think obviously internal combustion is key to the operation of the car.
Yeah. But
to put your head under the hood, look at the mechanical structure of the internal combustion engine and then say, now we know that there was no Henry Ford, is very unfortunate. It's very irrational. So it would seem to me that when we look at Darwinism, at evolution, that's a fascinating study of process, how things happen. But it has nothing to do with the question, is there an intelligent mind behind the process or not? Instead, that becomes a philosophical question. And then the question becomes, in my experience and observation in life, does something as complicated as an internal combustion engine happen without a mind behind it? Or is it far more reasonable to believe, indeed, there is a Henry Ford, a mechanic behind that internal combustion engine? And just because I have an incredible talent in understanding how combustion engines work does not wipe out the mechanic behind it, the mind behind it, the Henry Ford. So just because I have grown in my understanding of biology, chemistry, physics, it has nothing to say whether there is an intelligent mind behind it or not. How do you respond to that?
That's a very good way of putting it. It seems to me that this is the classic argument from Paley. You know, if you were walking in the fields and you came across a watch, you would think, gosh, there must be a watchmaker.
Right.
Given that the world is highly structured, ordered in some sense, and is full of very complicated, rich and beautiful beasts, there must be a beast maker. My argument to that is that this is where I agree with Richard Dawkins, and I'll explain where I don't agree, is that essentially we have a mechanism by which complex organisms can emerge. And we know about the process of differential survival of organisms that are adapted to their environment and so on, and the process of mutation driving change and enabling, as it were, there to be a choice between organisms that survive and organisms that don't survive. So I think we can probably explain the emergence of complex organisms by Darwinian processes. What we can't explain are two things. One is the origin of life itself. That is very difficult. Even unicellular life is baffling, and the closer you look at a cell, the more absolutely astonishing it is. And that's the first thing we can't explain. And the second thing is, if we assume that life, let's say, came 500 million years ago or whatever, perhaps longer, that's perhaps even billions of years ago, there must have been a period before life, and therefore a period before consciousness. So the universe must have been entirely insentient for many billion years of its life. And what we cannot explain is how, in an insentient universe, consciousness emerged, conscious life emerged, and ultimately conscious subjects with viewpoints like us three. And I think that those are things that I don't think evolution explains, nor has it got the ability to explain those things. It's got no nearer to the origin of life. Once you've got life, fine, then you can start having Darwinian processes. So I have to completely agree with you about things that are unexplained, but I can't basically build a God out of those gaps.
Well, I appreciate your thoughtfulness, sir. Now, it seems to me that there's much evidence to support evolution as a process. But to support evolution as an origin, I find to be total blind faith. Why? I am convinced there is no evidence of a creative mechanism within evolution. As you put it, there's no way to define how life originated. So therefore, I have to ask myself the question, is it more reasonable for me to believe that life comes from life or that life comes from non-life? Is it more reasonable for me to believe that consciousness comes from non-consciousness? Or is it more reasonable for me to believe, more plausible for me to believe, that consciousness comes from consciousness? Is it more reasonable for me to believe that reason comes from reason? Or is it more reasonable for me to believe that reason can come from non-reason? Is it more reasonable for me to believe that life comes from life, or that life can come from non-life? And Raymond, all of my experience of life and observation is you never get reason from non-reason, you never get consciousness from non-consciousness, you never get life from non-life. There seems to be a uniformity in the world that I live in and my observation that reason comes from reason, life comes from life, consciousness comes from non-consciousness. And that is why I am driven to bow before God in awe of the incredible gifts that he's given us. Does that make any sense?
It most certainly does. I mean, there's two responses I would have to that. First of all, just remind ourselves of how Darwin's theory has survived all sorts of discoveries and technologies that he never even dreamt of in 1859. For example, carbon dating, the genome, continental drift, all of those, filling in the fossil record, all of those have increased the power and of Darwinian theory. But having said that, I would agree with you that we have this outstanding problem of the place of the mind in the cosmos. Thomas Nagel has written beautifully about this, and he points out that basically natural selection enables, as it were, evolution to choose between this and that, but it cannot bring in brand new things like consciousness. And if consciousness is not at the beginning, there's no way that natural selection is actually going to generate consciousness. And in fact, this is confidential, consciousness is pretty useless. I mean, if you're really serious about replication, just rely on the mechanisms, the unexceptional laws of nature, rather than on this rather wobbly stuff called consciousness. So I'm with you on all of that. It's just that I don't go from that to embrace either Buddhism, say, which doesn't have a God, or Christianity, which does have a God. You know, it doesn't take me to the next step. That is to say, we share completely our view that we cannot understand the origin of life out of non-life, or the origin of consciousness in an insentient universe.
I understand, but it seems to me to be inescapable that order and design, precise rational thinking, comes from a rational mind, comes from a designer. I mean, I have great respect for you, Raymond, in your intellect, in your study, in your writing, in the books that you've written. I can promise you, I do not have that kind of intellectual skill that you possess. Just in my limited way, when I try and put thoughts together and think logically, in my physical activity, I tried to play basketball in university, and I was the worst player on the team. I just barely made the team.
And I would have been worse than you if you were.
To simply get a ball to go through a metal hoop 10 feet above the floor of the gymnasium was incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
So this whole idea that order and design come about by chance, I just find so preposterous. I mean, I've tried to study and head towards an intellectual level that you have already achieved, and I fell far short. So it just seems to me so clear that order and design, education, rational thinking demands a degree of specificity, a degree of thoughtfulness, a degree of rationality that points me to a designer.
I guess, I mean, that comes back to something you referred to in relation to Darwin. I mean, I think if the designer was serious about designing universe, clearly the process of evolution is very messy and extraordinarily cruel. I mean, I think you were referring to Darwin's obsession about the ichneumon fly that lays its eggs in the caterpillar, and the caterpillar basically dies a horrible death with all these wriggling ichneumon flies. And that's part of normal nature, you know, the tiger sinking its teeth into the gazelle, etc., etc. So, I mean, if I was a designer, and far be it from me to criticize any capital D designer, I wouldn't choose evolution as a way of bringing it about. I would just simply present a completed job, rather as is described in Genesis, where, you know, the whole thing is set up in 7 days. That seems to me very much the work of a designer. So if one accepts evolutionary theory, I think that has, it raises questions about the nature of any designer, as well as seeming in some respects to enable us to do without the idea of a designer, to deal with Paley's watch and so on.
Wouldn't there be a bigger issue there for the atheist, though? Because, I mean, if we're simply raised red in tooth and claw, and we go down to the creek bed and we see this big fly landing on top of a frog and sucking out its brains, like Annie Dillard talked about in our Pulitzer Prize winner, how do we get to the point where when we think through, okay, I either need a lobotomy or this is just the way things are, and so why do we call it evil? Why do we have such a problem with it? Now, Darwin himself said, with evolution, you can get the survival of the fittest, certainly, but you can't get morality. It's impossible to get morality. And then you get social contract theory, et cetera, that people come up with. But I think for me, yes, the problem of evil and suffering is definitely tough for a Christian to deal with. But I would say it's just as tough, if not even tougher, for an atheist who has this problem or this struggle with what we see in nature as so challenging and calling it evil. I mean, what morally in us wants to truly change things? Why can't we just let that happen? Why in the savannah, when you have two gazelle grazing, a brother and a sister, and a lion comes up and picks off the sister, does the brother pick his head up and then put it right back down and start grazing again after the coast is clear, perhaps for himself? And why do we call these things bad? That's just the way it is. And so from a human perspective, a human level, it's not just we've evolved perhaps further along down the line from them, and so now all of a sudden we really care about each other and we really don't want to see evil and suffering happen. No, I think there's something more. I think there's a moral conscience. I think there's a tremendous thirst for the good. And I love how, I think I saw an interview of yours that's titled "The Ultimate Questions of Life That Science Can or Can't Answer." And I think these are some of the ultimate questions in life that science almost contradicts in a way. And we have to deal with it from a level of either having God or not. And that's why I also think it's interesting how your book is talking about these realities separate from science and God. And you refer to that as trying to offend everybody, which I like the edginess.
So it has an even-handedness about it, doesn't it?
It's not PC. We like PC over here, Raymond.
But it is interesting. I mean, it seems to me that there are biological explanations, inverted commas, of the origin of altruism, for example, a supreme expression of morality. Basically, if you lay down your life for 8 half-brothers, your genes are being replicated quite usefully. That's the joke of JBS Haldane and so on and so forth. Patricia Churchland, who is a neurophilosopher, thinks that our morality comes from the fact that our children require basically nourishing for much longer than than many other animals, and that long period of development where we protect them extends our concern beyond ourselves to our children in the first instance, and then that starts the process. So there are, as it were, explanations of the origin of morality. I think all of those, which sort of relate us directly to Darwin, fail. I think we've got to look again at how we are so different from our nearest primate kin, and how did we get to be so different? And there are many explanations, but it was a very long process. But at the heart is something I think I mentioned earlier at the beginning, which is intentionality. Our sense of ourselves, our sense of others, the fact we belong to a community of minds, and other animals may belong to herds and groups, but don't belong to communities of minds in the way that we do. Jane Goodall, very famous primatologist, said her overwhelming sense was that the gorillas she observed were isolated. They were almost like Leibnizian monads. They weren't part of a community of mind. And it's in that community of mind, that mutual dependency for our very self, which is basically expressed in language. I mean, nothing I would say could make sense to me if I didn't have a community to whom it made sense. So we're so deeply embedded in each other. I think that's the source of our morality. As to how we got there, I'm happy to give you the 1-paragraph summary of the 1,000 pages of the trilogy. But it seems to me that we've got enough, as it were, to explain the origin of morality without necessarily looking to a God that implanted it in us.
I caught you being politically incorrect again right there.
What did I say? I've forgotten.
You said you said mind a few times. Aren't you supposed to say brain?
Not. Oh, thank you for saying that. Cute. This is. Don't throw me into the briar patch. This is underarm puzzle, isn't it? It seems to me that I do believe in the mind. You're quite right. And as far as I'm concerned, we are not just our brains. I mean, if you want to understand me better, you'll understand much more by talking to me than peering into my intracranial darkness with some clever machine like an fMRI scan or whatever, because the brains of all of us are very similar, and there's not much happened to the brain in the last, well, a long period of time. Say very little's happened to the brain in the last 10 or 12,000 years, but gosh, an awful lot has happened to us as social beings. In a way, our evolution is very much in that community of minds to which we belong. A community of mind that's scaffolded by institutions, by a landscape of artifacts, by laws, and so on. But now I'm drifting off in all directions, aren't I?
Raymond, one of the reasons that Jesus Christ makes so much sense to me is because my observation of reality squares with his depiction. You began by pointing out if evolution was really something that God intended, he did a pretty bad job. Well, and you referenced Genesis chapter 1. If you go 2 chapters further to Genesis chapter 3 and read about the fall, you begin to understand that indeed this world is not the way God created it to be. And indeed, evolution is not a beautiful, beautiful system. There's obviously many problems. And when we look at life and when we experience life, there is much good, but there is a tremendous amount of pain, suffering, evil, and obviously we all die. That is part of why I think Jesus Christ is such a viable option for a thinking human being, because his depiction of reality and the Bible's depiction of reality is spot on with our experience of reality. We have this innate drive for meaning and purpose. Well, if there's no God creates us for a purpose, then sure we can create a purpose, but we've got to be honest enough to if my purpose today I define it being to love you, but tomorrow I define it as being to hate you. I'm right today and tomorrow I'm wrong today and right tomorrow. It's all basically a creation of my mind. And Jesus Christ points out, no, God created us for the purpose of loving him with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And as I observe life and experience life, that makes a lot of sense. I also have this drive for life after death. Why? Because death ends the relationships. When people say to me, oh, I don't care, when I die, I die. No, I think as you've pointed out very eloquently, sir, community means a tremendous amount to us as human beings. Well, death ends community, obviously. It ends relationships. Jesus Christ insisted, indeed, community can go on for eternity in heaven. Relationships, in other words, are of ultimate significance. And by gollies, when I begin to realize that God is a triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who's lived in love relationship throughout eternity, and we've been created to reflect this community, to reflect this love. Gosh, Raymond, that makes an awful lot of sense in terms of my experience of reality. Does that make any sense?
It's certainly very attractive. I mean, one of the preoccupations I have is being bereaved. Now, I love my wife 50 years on. The thought of living on after her without being able to say we will meet is unbearable. And so I would very much like it to be true that we would meet. Although I'm not too sure how much eternity could stand, or how much eternity could stand of me. But it's so one would very much like to believe that. But I have to say I have a very deep interest in the Christian religion, and in particular the idea of God become man, of the incarnate word, the incarnate God, because to me it captures our extraordinary nature. We are embodied. I am both a body and a spirit, or a mind, and the mind is clearly transcendent. Me talking to you now, you're making sense of what I'm saying. It's clearly not something that can be interpreted in terms of the homeostatic mechanisms in my body. So in that sense, it is, to me, it's metaphysically profound, the whole story of the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. I just think it's a most beautiful and brilliant metaphor for our condition of embodiment.
Right, but the interesting thing is
an embodied self, an embodied self.
Right, but the interesting thing is Jesus was not a metaphor.
Cliffe, you're wobbling in and out. I beg your pardon, but you're wobbling in about the not at all. It's not your fault. It's the signal seems to be coming and going a bit. Yeah.
Right.
Testing 1 2. Can you hear us
now? You're frozen.
It's a little rainy over here.
Can I hear? Right. Would you be able to cut this bit out? I hope if.
Yeah, we go. Yeah, there we go.
Oh gosh, you're frozen again, alas.
That's
Yep, you're living beings again. Yes.
Oh, we are.
So, again, I think it's the most. How are you doing? Are you all right?
We can hear you. Yes, sir.
That's what it means to me.
Mhm.
Great.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of other religions, especially Buddhism, or you think of different, Confucianism, you think of other different philosophies, all of them has to do with the cosmic principle or pantheism, getting in touch with different forms of God here on this earth. Earth is part of God, obviously. So that is radically different from Christianity in the sense of, you talked about the logos when we started out, and that was known to the Greeks to be a divine principle. But then the logos for Christians, right out of the Gospel of John, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. All of a sudden, God became human. And so now there's this tremendous weight of our entire worldview stands on whether historically something occurred, that is the birth, life, and then death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, or whether it didn't occur. And so I find a lot of my friends will say, well, yeah, I can get in touch with God some kind of way. And it's cool that you're religious. And yeah, I think that's tremendously important for culture. And it'd be tragic if religion somehow was pushed out of culture. But for me, it's so different from what they say because it stands on was Jesus Christ, was his character or his claims, and then ultimately was his corpse raised from the dead, or is his grave still full? That's the whole crux of the matter. And so walking through this with, say, an atheist, for example, is always a pleasure because so frequently they'll just think it's about being a good person, or it's about somehow believing without evidence, or somehow it's just you're raised in the faith. Instead, it's looking at the historical evidence, looking at the character, looking at the claims, yes, looking at the impact, looking at whether the resurrection, the evidence for the resurrection actually occurred. And we don't all have to have PhDs in history to become Christians.
No.
And yet I just noticed so many atheists, humanists, Buddhists, it doesn't matter what, oftentimes won't actually really wrestle with the evidence behind the historical potential veracity of what happened to Jesus Christ. Instead, philosophers that we'll have on, for example, who are atheists, will just say, well, I'm not a historian. I don't really know. And so I find that very interesting because obviously to be truth seekers, I need to be able to get into the shoes of a secular humanist. Secular humanist needs to get into the shoes of a Christian. And I can't just look at the Quran and say, oh, kill the infidel is all I need to know about the Quran and how Muslims behave. No, obviously I need to look at manuscript evidence. I need to look at, okay, does the Quran actually uphold itself in the sense of it is a perfect book and it can tell us everything? So that's just one piece I'll often find with any atheist, really, where it's, no, this is actually a worldview that stands on a historical event either actually having occurred or not.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I mean, coming back to our discussion earlier about explaining how the world came to be so designed and so on, the reason I don't see those, as it were, a personal God-shaped gap to be, or that the hole is to be filled by a personal God, is that, of course, there are many religions for which there is no personal God, and there are many religions for which there is no God. But clearly they also tangle with these things, with this sense of a cosmic order and so on and so forth. It becomes almost, for somebody moving in from the outside who hasn't been brought up in the Christian religion, it becomes almost, as it were, a choice to be made in the shopping mall of ideas as to whether one chooses Buddhism or Christianity or and so on. So I think that's why, as it were, one can't go from the failure of Darwinism to explain the origin of life or the origin of consciousness to a particular religion, one of the Abrahamic religions with a personal God and so on.
But just because there are different religions doesn't tell us anything about God. It tells us more about human beings.
Absolutely.
In the same way, just because there are different views of evolution doesn't tell me too much about evolution. I have to go and study and figure out what does the evidence point to. And so I think the same thing is true regarding a plethora of religions, be it Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity. The question is not, well, because there's so many different religions, therefore there is no God who I could really know. No, I think the question is, what does the evidence point to as being reliable? And when I study Buddhism, I respect, obviously, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha for his emphasis on suffering and working through the problem of suffering. But when he comes to the solution as being cutting off my desires, I find that to be highly, highly suspicious. Desires for good, desires for life, desires to love, desires to promote justice are crucial to life. And for me just to cut off all of my desires and then to look forward supposedly to becoming one with the universe by becoming fertilizer, I mean, I'm sorry, I just don't, I got real questions. And then
I don't find that an attractive option either, I have to say. I mean, my dream is not to become a small pyramid of ashes. It's not, as it were, the outcome I'd wish. It's just the one I probably think is likely. But it's interesting you were talking about logos, and in my book on logos, I've traced what I think is very interesting, the trajectory of logos from the pre-Socratic philosophers, particularly Heraclitus, through Plato, then through, very importantly, Plotinus, and most importantly, Philo of Alexander, who brought together both the Greek and Jewish traditions. And so by the time logos, as it were, was incarnate in Jesus Christ, it had had quite a complicated journey, a journey that one can understand in historical and cultural terms.
And I think those all marvelously point to the existence of some type of God. And then we human beings are struggling through, who is this God? And obviously the Hebrew prophets claimed that God was speaking through them. And then obviously Jesus Christ makes this incredible claim to actually be God, revealing himself in a form that you and I, with our finite, limited minds, can begin to understand. And I really respect Einstein, who acknowledged that indeed there was a fudge factor that he had put in, some little dishonesty, in order to disprove the Big Bang, because Einstein began to realize, whoa, golly whoppers, if there is a beginning, if there really is a Big Bang, then pantheism doesn't tell me the truth. There's got to be some type of intelligent mind, some type of creator, and obviously he embraced some type of deism, I think, from his own worldview.
He thought he was a Spinozist in some way, which essentially identifies God and nature. That was very much his position. Yes.
But I think he really saw the logical implications of the Big Bang. If there is a Big Bang that occurred 15 billion years ago, or far more than that actually, does that not necessitate a designer, a creator of some type? I mean, everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe must have a cause.
The problem comes when you come to a first cause, and of course God is invoked as the first cause, the uncaused cause.
Yes.
But for someone like myself, who is a secular humanist, an uncaused cause isn't, as it were, an explanation. It doesn't really bring the, as it were, the journey to a halt. It just, as it were, it's a placeholder.
I think that I totally agree on the infinite regress part of that. And yet you certainly need a being outside of space and time. And I personally believe it would also have to be being that's immaterial, omnipotent, omniscient, personal. I mean, I think it would need all these characteristics to explain human life as well, and the beginning of time. So in order to prevent that infinite regress, you do have to have a being outside of space and time. I think just like the resurrection, the beginning of the cosmos, it's impossible to explain the two. There are some theories, but I don't know any scholar that really puts a ton of weight in the basket, and certainly has questions too. We're on this one as well. But when it comes, for example, of whether multiverse, so there's just an amount of is out there, and how we land one that could have potential in human life. I mean, there's evidence for it, but philosophers just go ahead and posit type of theory to somehow explain how we get just resurrection. You know, a lot sometimes to me, but there's a scholar who's respected actually one of these true, and some of those theories, the swoon, Jesus just away. He right. One is the Romans or the Jews. One is mass hallucination, and all of kind of there's never, especially in the last type of theory, to rebut. I just noticed when it comes to the origin verses. So it's this thing kind of.
Stuart, I'm afraid for the last minute or so you've been chopping up a bit. So I couldn't quite hear you for the last minute or so. And you're freezing.
Messing with in the back.
Sorry about that.
The last. You and
now you've both got frozen smiles.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm afraid it's still wobbly. Yeah.
You bet.
An hour, so wrap it up.
Yeah.
Hear me now?
Yep. That moment I did just now. Yes.
We respect your time. We're gonna have to we're over, but thanks so much for coming, and would love again at some future.
Raymond, it's a delight to speak with us.
Oh, it's been brilliant. What a lovely conversation. And I'm terribly impressed when father and son give each other time to speak. I've never seen that before.
Blessed father
Table is yes.
Very blessed.
Guys, thanks again. Ourselves, title ourselves, Reading Humanity and Science, and the second one is Newer Freedom and Impossible Reality. Check those. Your first time. Subscribe. We have some conversations and debates next week. So thank you again, Raymond.
Thank you so much, Raymond.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.